Jumping into our story, we'll go ahead and read it. We start with Mole and Rat's picnic. Leaving the main stream, they now passed into what seemed like a little landlocked lake. Green grass sloped down to either edge. Brown, snaky tree roots gleamed below the surface of the quiet water. Ahead of them could be heard the foamy tumble of the wire and a restless dripping mill wheel attached to a mill house. I'm going to take a quick pause right here in our story, and I want to share with you a little bit of this because remember we talked about this story comes from England and it was written over 100 years ago. Um, so we have here, this is going to be a picture of that wire, and this is just kind of like one of a dam that's blocking water so that water can flow very specifically where they want it to. The next thing I want to show you too is going to be that mill house where we see that giant mill wheel. And then this is going to be where it goes into. The purpose of this, the mill house, is where they bring in grain and they grind it into flour. So they use the water power from what we saw above to operate this wheel, and then it can grind grain into flour. So just kind of a little background on some of that language and knowing that we have different technology nowadays to do some of these same jobs that were needed over 100 years ago. And then we can keep reading. This scene was so beautiful that the mole could only hold up both forepaws and gasp, "Oh my!" The rat brought the boat alongside the bank and tied it up. Then he helped the still awkward mole safely ashore and swung out the luncheon basket. The mole asked to be allowed to unpack it all by himself. The rat was very pleased to indulge him. Mole excitedly took out the tablecloth and spread it out. Then, one by one, he took out the mysterious packets and carefully arranged them, still gasping, "Oh my, oh my." When all was ready, the rat said, "Eat up, old fellow." And the mole, who had started his spring cleaning at the very early hour, had not eaten since then, eagerly set to work. "What are you looking at?" said the rat presently, when the edge of the hunger was somewhat dulled, and the mole's eyes were able to wander off the tablecloth. "I'm looking," said the mole, "at a streak of bubbles that I see traveling along the surface of the water." "Bubbles? Oh!" said the rat cheerfully, and the broad glistening muzzle showed itself off the edge of the bank, and the otter hauled himself out and shook the water off his coat. "Greedy beggars," he observed. "Why didn't you invite me, Ratty?" "This was a spontaneous affair," explained the rat. "By the way, meet my friend, Mr. Mole." "Proud, I'm sure," said the otter, and the two animals were friends forthwith. "Such a rumpus everywhere," continued the otter. "The entire world seems to be out of the river today. I came up to this backwater to try and get a moment of peace, and stumbled upon you fellows." Otter and Badger. At that moment, there was a rustling sound behind them, and it seemed to come from a hedge wherein last year's leaves still clung. Seconds later, a stripy head with high shoulders peered from within. "Come on, old Badger," shouted the rat. The badger trotted forward, then grunted, "Humph, company," and he turned his back and disappeared from view. "That's just the sort of fellow he is," observed the disappointed rat. "Simply hates society. Now, we shan't see any more of him today. Well, tell us, who's out of the water?" "Toad's out for one," replied the otter. "His brand new wager boat, new togs, new everything." We're going to take a pause from our story again to kind of take a look at some of that a little bit. So they mention the new boat and the togs. So we come up to this one and we see our picture of Toad, who is going to be part of this. This is what that real toad is going to look like in real life. A wager boat is a special type of boat used for rowing and races, and they're called wager boats because people would wage bets. They would gamble on who the winner was going to be. And togs, they mention, are going to be a special type of clothes worn just for the activity of rowing those boats. The two animals looked at each other and laughed. "Once it was nothing but sailing," said the rat. "Then he tired of that and took up punting. Punting is a special flat-bottomed boat." Nothing would please him but to punt all day. Last year it was a houseboat, and we all had to go with him in his houseboat and pretend we liked it. It's all the same, whatever he takes up, he gets tired of it and starts on something fresh. Such a good fellow, too, remarked the otter reflectively, but no stability, especially in boats. Toad on the river. From where they sat, they could get a glimpse of the main stream across the island that separated them, and just then a wager boat flashed into view. The rower was a short, stout figure who was splashing badly and rolling a good deal, but working his hardest. The rat stood up and hailed him. However, Toad, for it was he, shook his head and concentrated on the task at hand. "He'll be out in the boat in a minute if he rolls like that," said the rat. "Of course he will," chuckled the otter. "Did I ever tell you that good story about Toad and the lock keeper?" "The story happened this way," Otter continued. "Toad—" And at that moment, a mayfly swerved steadily into the gentle spring breeze toward Otter. There was a swirl of water and a clop, and the mayfly was visible no more. Neither was the otter. The mole looked down. The voice was still in his ears, but the grass whereon he had sprawled was clearly vacant. Not an otter to be seen. But again there was a streak of bubbles on the surface of the river, and the rat hummed a tune. And the mole remembered that it was considered rude to make any sort of comment about the sudden disappearance of one's friends. "Well, well," said the rat, "I suppose we ought to be moving. I wonder which one of us should pack the luncheon basket." He did not seem very eager to do it himself. "Oh, please let me," said the mole. So, of course, the rat let him. The afternoon sun was getting low, and the rat sculled gently homewards. The mole was very full of lunch and self-satisfaction, and already quite at home in a boat. Or so he thought. He was, however, getting a bit restless, and presently he said, "Ratty, please, I want to row now." The rat shook his head with a smile. "Not yet, my young friend," he said. "Wait until you've had a few lessons." The mole was quiet for a moment or two, but he began to feel more and more jealous of Rat. Suddenly he jumped up and seized the sculls from him. Rat, who had been gazing out over the water, was taken by surprise. He fell backwards off his seat, and the triumphant mole took his place and grabbed the sculls with much confidence. "Stop it, you silly!" cried the rat from the bottom of the boat. "You'll have us over." Mole overturns the boat. The mole flung his sculls back with a flourish and made a great dig at the water. He missed the surface altogether. His legs flew up over his head, and he found himself lying on top of the rat. Greatly alarmed, he grabbed at the side of the boat, and the next moment, splosh! Over went the boat, and the mole found himself struggling in the river. Oh my, how cold the water was, and oh, how very wet it felt. How it sang in his ears and it went down, down, down. How bright and welcome the sun looked as he rose to the surface, coughing and sputtering. How black was his despair when he felt himself sinking again. Then a firm paw gripped him at the back of his neck. It was the rat, and he was laughing. The rat got hold of the skull and shoved it under the mole's arm. Then he did the same to the other side of him, and swimming behind, propelled the helpless animal to shore. When the rat had rubbed him down, wrung some of the wet out of him, he said, "Now then, old fellow, trot up and down till you're warm and dry again. I dive for the luncheon basket." So the dismal mole, wet and ashamed within, trotted about till he was fairly dry. While the rat plunged the water again, he recovered the boat, fetched the floating property, and finally dived successfully to get the luncheon basket. When all was ready to begin again, the mole limp and dejected, took his seat in the stern of the boat, and they all set off. He said in a low voice, "Ratty, my generous friend, I am so very sorry indeed for my foolish behavior. My heart quite fails me when I think how I might have lost that beautiful luncheon basket. I have been a fool. Will you ever forgive me?" "That's all right, bless you," responded the rat cheerfully. "What's a little wet to a water rat? I'm more in the water than I am most days. Don't you think any more about it. And, look here, I really think you had better come and stop by for some time. My home is very plain, and rough, but I am sure to make you comfortable, and I'll teach you to row and to swim." The mole was so touched by his kindness that he had to brush away a tear. But the rat kindly looked in another direction, and before long, the mole's spirits revealed again. The rat's home before the hearth. When they got home, the rat made a bright fire in the parlor. He planted the mole in his armchair in front of it. He fetched down a dressing gown and slippers for him, and told him river stories till supper time. Supper was a most cheerful meal. Shortly afterwards, a sleepy mole had to be escorted upstairs by his host to the best bedroom, where he laid his head on his pillow in great peace and contentment. This was just the beginning of their friendship and their time together on the river.